Hello, YouTube. My name is Alan, and it's that time once again. Let's talk metal. And for this episode, we're going to talk one of the great heavy metal bands of all time, veteran act that's been around for ages, but has never really gotten their due. They're a band that are still often overlooked, one of those names that many people have heard of, but haven't spent a lot of time actually listening to. I'm talking about Jag Panzer, favorite band of mine, and we're going to work through the discography, talk about all the different albums for this video. One thing to mention right off the bat here is the pronunciation. I tend to say Jag Panzer because, as far as I know, the name is German, and in German, the letter J is pronounced with a Y sound. The name Jag Panzer translates into hunting tank or tank destroyer. I've seen it translated both ways. So, pretty badass name either way. Either a tank that's hunting things down or something that's meant to destroy tanks. I have seen at least once a variation where somebody had it translated as hunting cat, like big cat, like panther or something. I don't think that's the right translation. To my knowledge, it's supposed to be, yeah, a hunting tank. So we'll go with that. But that's why I pronounce it as Jag rather than Jag. If you prefer to pronounce it as Jag, that's quite okay. This is not something to get upset about. It's not a matter of life and death. This is a matter of life and death, but we're not talking about that. Not for this video. But yeah, I will go with the Jagdpanzer pronunciation. It's just what I'm used to saying because of the German origin of the name. So yeah, the band's from Colorado Springs in Colorado. Early on, the US heavy metal, aka power metal scene, people, the line's a little blurry there for how those two are different in the early and mid 1980s scene. So I may use both terms back and forth a little bit for this video. But Jag Panzer released their first piece of vinyl. It's not a full album, but as their first release, I'll mention it briefly. It was an EP with a kind of iconic cover artwork of, lady wielding a chainsaw in some kind of, bombed out post-Armageddon, urban landscape. And this one goes by the names either Battle Zones, it's also been referred to as Tyrants, and also just self-titled Jag Panzer EP. But yeah, this picture disc has an insert. This is an insert here, not the back of the actual disc. But at the time, they're operating as a four-piece and kind of showcases the style they go for right away. It's, very, tough, muscular, hard-hitting, traditional or, power metal, whichever one you want to use in that early 80s US scene. Good stuff, kind of sets the table for their first album that would come out the next year. Now, in these early years, Jag Panzer were on the, Azra Ironworks label, and that label tended to put out lots of different shaped picture discs and stuff. And there are some variations on Battle Zones, and I think a 7-inch for Jag Panzer 2. But yeah, the thing Panzer are known for is the first full-length LP, which is known as Ample Destruction. There are multiple variations of this that were made. I've done a separate video a long time ago showing off several of the different versions, but it's not a hard record to acquire. The basic version's always been readily available, usually like in the $40-50 range. It's been reissued multiple times. Those are readily available. You will see it with different cover artwork. The UK and I think Canadian presses both have different covers back in the day. Those have been reissued. There's another reissue that has a completely different, more kind of sci-fi looking cover. So there's a lot of versions of it, but the bottom line is if you want a copy, it's not hard to find and you don't have to spend a lot of money. And you should want a copy because while I am biased somewhat, I honestly do feel like this is one of the absolute gems, real hallmarks of the early 80s US traditional heavy metal scene. This should be, a top 5 record on pretty much anybody's list. If you like things such as the first the first Metal Church album or the first Omen album, Ample Destruction is right there side to side with those, and maybe a little bit above even those kind of albums. things that make Panzer great. At this point, they were up to a five-piece. They'd added guitar virtuoso Joe Tafola for the album. So yeah, they've got a great guitar duo here. Mark Briotti is been in the band pretty much since day one and is always a great guitarist. They also feature the vocals of, Harry the Tyrant Conklin, and he's one of the strongest singers in a U.S. heavy metal band, bar none. He's got a great sort of, deep baritone kind of voice, but he can sing with a lot of power. He can also sing with a lot of emotion and feeling when the song calls for it. So you have a killer lineup, you've got a killer piece of cover art, and you have a track list that is just front to back pretty damn amazing. These are classics of the genre. And again, while everybody's tastes are a little different, it's really hard for me to believe that anybody who's into this kind of early US metal scene would not rank this album very, very highly unless they simply are not very familiar with the album. And again, Panzer is one of those bands that a lot of people have never gotten around to checking out. So it does happen. But yeah, when I discuss this album with some folks and they're like, yeah, I don't know about that one. I think I'd listen to, Omen or Warlord or stuff above. And like, okay, well, how much have you played this one? Like, well, I've never really, I've heard it maybe once or twice. Okay, go do your homework. And I think you'll really enjoy the album. Not that they have to make it their favorite of all time, but I do think fans of that style would be hard pressed to not really love the album. It's just that damn good. They have a very tough sound, like I said, sort of, very bit aggressive, kind of muscular sound. They can certainly rein it in a little bit, though, and do some more grand, epic sounding tracks. And these come across, as, like very sort of, take no prisoners, grand, defiant kind of atmosphere to them. But they also have a very sort of gritty, blue collar, street level feel. And this was not a band that just wanted to sing about, cars and beer and parties and swords and castles and dragons. The fighting songs feel a lot more like, they're street tough songs. We're not running around with an enchanted sword. We're running around with a baseball bat with some nails in it. We're not, singing about, distant faraway lands. We're just gonna, go out and duke it out in the alley to deal with this matter. And it just works really, really brilliantly. Uh, Classic album. If there's a downside to all of that, it's that Panzer always kind of lives in the shadow of this album. Again, they've got a long discography. We're going to keep moving through things here. But they are one of those bands where people will often say, like, yeah, that other album is pretty good too, but it's no Ample Destruction. People can say it's unfair for everyone to keep comparing everything back to an album that's now over 40 years old, but it does happen in situations like this. There are some other reasons that Ample Destruction also kind of got ingrained into everybody's, psyche compared to the other albums. And that's kind of the schedule of releases. Like I said, this came out in 84. We're going to have to go through a few things on the phone here because I don't have physical copies of everything in their catalog. But yeah, they made a demo called Shadow Thief in 1986. I do have a bootleg copy of that. This is on the old Reborn Classics series. They would put, two hard to find, maybe like demo unreleased recordings together. But because they're jamming two things onto each disc, they very often would leave some tracks off, so the recordings weren't always complete. Back when these were made in the 90s, it was the only way to get some of this music. Since then, a lot of these things have been reissued in much nicer versions, so I don't know if there's a lot of demand for the Reborn Classic ones anymore, but I still have a couple of them, and Shadow Thief demo from Jag Panzer is one. So yeah, this still has, the same lineup from Ample Destruction. All five guys are still in the band. It's a good set of songs. It does open kind of oddly with a cover of Inagata Davida. That's right, the old Iron Butterfly hit from the late 60s. But other tracks like Shadow Thief are really good. Out of Sight, Out of Mind is fantastic. Something you hear in a few of these songs is the band going for a little bit more melody backing off the aggression a little bit. Out of Sight, Out of Mind is a really good example of that. They do it fantastically. It's not a knock whatsoever. It's just maybe a little bit of a change from what the core sound was on Ample Destruction. But there are still some, just, real straightforward grinders on here too, like Lustful and Free and Viper. So, really good demo. Um, it's been, released in more legit forms since then. And the demo kind of prepped them for recording what was supposed to be their second album called Chain of Command. And I said supposed to because, yeah, Chain of Command didn't get a full release until much later. It was supposed to come out in 87. It was recorded in 87. Seeing if there's a picture of it readily available here, but I don't think there is. So we'll come back to that maybe later. So yeah, they record Chain of Command. Lineup issues are sort of a thing by that point. Um, and the band just kind of, falls apart, calls it a day. You know, they never had a lot of, money. There wasn't a huge scene in Colorado at the time. Just, access to good recording equipment and stuff like that kind of eluded them. And so, for years, Jag Panzer was kind of known as one of these one and done bands, essentially. They made this one killer album, and that was the last anybody really heard of them other than a demo. However, in the kind of mid 90s, they did resurface with a different lineup to offer up their second album. The way you count the Egg Panzer albums is a little weird. I think the band considers Chain of Command to be the second album because it was recorded as an album and did get released much later on. So I guess in a way, the album from the mid 90s is their third album. Sure, we'll count it that way. The album's called Dissident Alliance. Uh, and again, you've got a different lineup here. Like, Conklin is not in the band, Tofola's, not around. The album cover is shown here. It's a really bad example of mid 1990s computer generated artwork. It's like, some kind of like it looks like, like big spiky iron balls floating around in lava. I don't know what's going on with this, other than it doesn't look very good whatsoever. And it's kind of appropriate because the music on here is not very good whatsoever either. I tend to forget this album even exists. It's so bad I just try to erase it from my memory. When I decided I wanted to do a video on the discography, I forgot to even jot it down on the list of albums at first. And then I looked back over, so like, oh wait, there's another album there, and I'm going to have to replay it. And it's every bit as bad as Legend Tells. The Metal Archives has 3 reviews for the album with an average score of 19%. Now, Metal Archives, you got to take with a grain of salt when it comes to reviews, but yeah, in this case, they're pretty much spot on. The album's a good, and by good I mean bad, example of that mid 90s thrash sound where they're trying to be very, very aggro, but without a lot of focus and without the riffs to back it up. And it's a real mess of an album. It sounds nothing like their 80s material. The icing on the cake is some of the just most god-awful lyrics you could ever want to not hear in a heavy metal song. Let's go to the actual words here. I'm not including clips of stuff in this video. Jag Panzer stuff is easy to hear on YouTube anyway. But yeah, and I just pulled this up as like a random song. I didn't try to dig through the album for the worst lyrics I could find, but song number 2 is called The Clown. Already not a very heavy metal sounding song title. But yeah, let's look at one of the verses here from The Clown. It goes, little boy, tell me true. Johnny does the nasty. Do you know who? Little boy, did you cry? Mama's gone away. Daddy tell a lie. I wish I was making this up. I'm not making this up. The lyrics really are that bad. And again, that's not even the worst set of lyrics on the album. Um, in summary, unmitigated disaster. Nothing sounds good here. This really should be put up there alongside things like the least successful human cannonball and the Morbid Angel album that begins with I, Illum Diabolus, nobody likes it. Those two albums might actually have more strong selling points than Dissident Alliance. It really is that bad. You almost have to hear it once just to fully grok how bad this album is. And I'm saying this as a big fan of Jag Panzer, but man, they tried to go down a different path and it did not work for them at all. So, when you crash and burn like that, what do you do? Well, one option is you go back to what works, and that is what Panzer did. They went back and got Harry Conklin back in the band. Conklin had worked with a lot of other projects over the years. For example, he worked with Satan's Host. He was this close to being the vocalist for Riot at one point, and there was actually a couple of songs recorded and demoed with him. Um, yeah, the stars just would never quite line up where he could join Riot as the vocalist. But yeah, imagine what would have happened if Harry Conklin joined Riot there in the mid 80s when they were in their kind of hiatus between the Rhett Forrester albums and before Thundersteel came out. What would Thundersteel sound like with Harry Conklin singing on it? It exists in some parallel universe. Crazy to think about. But anyway, so they get Conklin back in the lineup. They get Tofola to rejoin as well. And in 97, they actually get to put out their fourth album, at least the fourth the way we're counting here, on Century Media. They got picked up by Century Media and released The Fourth Judgment, which I'm pulling up on the phone here. Um, so yeah, this is the original cover art for The Fourth Judgment. Again, it's been reissued at least once or twice by now, and I've seen one version that has different cover art. But yeah, so this is getting most of the classic lineup back together and returning closer to the classic sound. Now, the Fourth Judgment, a lot of the material on here is not as maybe aggro as Ample Destruction had been. But again, it's 13 years later. You can't expect him to tackle it with exactly the same level of teenage young adult testosterone when it's been over a decade. Nevertheless, it works really well. Jag Panzer kind of starts to develop more of a, mid-paced focused, really crunchy, heavy sounding US metal. And it works great. Conklin's voice is still in great shape. Mark and Joe sound fantastic on guitars. Everyone always puts in a solid performance. And there's a lot of great tracks on here. It's nice to see Shadow Thief get a proper treatment and release on an album. Other ones on here, very solid as well. And the album went over very well, which was kind of one of those pleasant surprises. I think one thing that helped this album kind of go over the top a bit was just the timing was right. Because 1997 was the year where traditional heavy metal started to make a comeback in the United States. I know, yes, if you're in Europe or parts of Asia, this stuff never really went away. But in the 90s, this stuff was really sort of dead in the water in the United States. I mean, trying to be like a traditional metal band in Colorado in the 1990s, you might as well have been on Mars trying to attract an audience. In that sense, the Dissident Alliance experiment is a little understandable because the style they had played before would not have done them any good in terms of trying to get any kind of record sales or visibility in the mid 90s. So they probably felt like they had to try something different. Sadly, it didn't work, but by 97, you had some other big albums come out from European bands that started to break through in the United States. The big example is, Hammerfall's debut, Glory to the Brave. Uh, if this was before your time, I cannot emphasize enough how much hype there was around this album in 97 and going into 98. Nuclear Blast put a lot of publicity behind this album. And yeah, this really did take the US by storm. And Hammerfall, say what you will about them. If nothing else, they were great ambassadors for traditional heavy metal because they were always talking up these older bands that they liked. They covered a lot of songs from bands like Storm Witch and Warlord and Pretty Maids. And so all of a sudden, a new generation of heavy metal fans were wanting to check out this stuff from the early and mid 80s that had been kind of collecting dust for a number of years by then. The Hammerfall album wasn't the only one that came out in 97 that did well. From Italy, you had the debut from Rhapsody, which is split into multiple different Rhapsody, Rhapsody of Fire, Luca Turilli's Rhapsody, blah, 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 whatever. But yeah, their debut, Legendary Tales, excellent album. And this one kind of, slowly, gained more and more traction and kind of started to get a good reputation in the US. I don't have a copy of it, but Stratovarius released their Visions album, which is somewhere around album five. A little rusty on the Stratovarius catalog. But they had been churning out a lot of albums in the 90s, kind of going from strength to strength, gaining momentum, and Stratovarius were getting more visible by then. Blind Guardian started to get more attention, although I don't think they released an album in 97. They had been putting out a lot of quality stuff. So again, I think just the timing was right. People in the US were ready to pay attention to this kind of metal again. And so Jag Panzer was like, well, hey, we're an American band playing something similar. And yeah, here you go. Century Media had the distribution. Jag Panzer had a little bit of this kind of reputation as, an older band coming back out. And they put forth a really good album, and it worked really well for them. And after this, they start to really gain momentum. It kind of feels like the band tries to make up for lost time because they start putting out albums pretty fast at this point. In 98, I believe it is. Let me check. There's like 1 year where they skip an album. So yeah, 97 was The Fourth Judgment, very good album. 1998 saw them come right back with The Age of Mastery. Slightly different lineup here. Now, Tofola leaves the band, but they bring in guitarist hotshot Chris Broderick, who of course would go on to more fame with Megadeth and In Flames. But yeah, they replace one great guitarist with another and put out what, in my opinion, is their best album from these reunion years. This one's doing the same basic things that they were doing on The Fourth Judgment. Again, a big focus on mid-tempo, pure US traditional heavy metal, border pushing over into that US power metal sound. Strong vocals, great guitar work. Um, the reason I think this one's a little better is just I think this is the better set of songs. I think song for song, I prefer this set. A lot of people I think prefer The Fourth Judgment, and that's quite okay. But yeah, you've got, Iron Eagle has a real pounding, almost kind of majestic sound to it. And that's something that Panzer was always incredibly good at. They had a top-notch vocalist, which is something that so many bands in the 80s lacked. But Conklin could always deliver. And so, yes, he can make some of these songs sound very regal, very, you put this stuff on a pedestal. They're just a cut above a lot of the competition. You've got a cover of an old Jack Starr song on here called False Messiah that Jack did on his solo album that Rhett Forster sang on. Kind of an obscure thing to cover, but I've always loved the original version, and Panzer does a really nice cover of it here too. One other one that's worth pointing out is the closing track, The Moors. On this one, the band is leaning a little bit more into something that sounds a little like folksy. They're not above, getting into something that sounds like a little more traditional fare. Some tracks around this time are starting to see, some violins, a little bit of strings, maybe a little piano work creep in here and there. But it's not in a cheesy sense whatsoever. It doesn't feel forced. It's not a gimmick because they can make that work with their delivery incredibly well. And so, yeah, the Moors has this kind of, little chanty sing along, but, more of a traditional thing. You really can feel like it's, maybe got like an Irish or Scottish folk music, flavor worked into it. Moving forward, Panzer would do multiple songs in the same vein as the Moors. This became something that they would revisit this style of song on a lot of the later albums, and the song almost always turns out to be really good every single time. So yeah, album number five, The Age of Mastery, great one in the catalog. All right, we go into 1999, and let's see, no, 99 is the one year that gets skipped. Okay, so we had albums in 97, 98, no new album in 99, but in 2000 they were right back, and Century Media puts out album number six, which is called Thane to the Throne, which I don't own a physical copy of, so let's pull it up over here. The big deal with this one was that Jag Panzer made a concept album, and they are tackling Shakespeare with this one. Thane to the Throne is a concept which tells the story of Macbeth. Cover art shown here. It is far from my favorite Jag Panzer cover art, to be honest. You can see, the witches talking to Macbeth and all there. I just don't like the art style on this one. It's, got kind of a weird watercolor look to it. Not the direction I would have gone in. It's not horrible or anything, but yeah, I don't think it quite does the album justice. Shakespeare, of course, pretty heavy stuff to try to tackle. Most heavy metal bands would steer clear of that. Yeah, again, it's like, well, give me some schlocky, paperback fantasy novel with a sword and a dragon and an elf, and I'll make an album about that. Panzer, they are a cut above, and they're going to go to the deeper, tougher source material with Shakespeare. Interviews with the band around that time, they were quick to point out, it's like, hey, yeah, Shakespeare may seem daunting, but it's perfect heavy metal material. Shakespeare is full of people getting murdered and betrayed and weird supernatural events. Damn, Shakespeare was a headbanger. It's just a few centuries too early, maybe. So yeah, they do a nice job of kind of translating the play into a concept album. Performances here are great. It works really well, except there's one fatal flaw. And I've said a lot of nice things about the album, but it's actually my least favorite album that isn't called Dissident Alliance. The problem you run into on Thane to the Throne is that the songs, as individual songs, just never will stick with you. Yeah, they flow together. If you listen to the whole thing front to back because you want to hear them telling you the story of Macbeth, it works. If you want to hear just like one or two songs, they never stick with me. And other reviewers, have mentioned this problem about the album too. They're like, I can play this album three times in a row, and 10 minutes later, I can't tell you a single riff off the album. And that's always been my problem with Thane to the Throne too. I got it when it came out. I've revisited it several times over the years. I can't name a single song. I can't hum a single tune. Just it has never stuck. And it's something that does happen to concept albums sometimes. The really classic, immortal, top-notch S-tier kind of concept albums are the ones where there's a great story, great performances, but you can pull out a lot of the individual songs and just have a really good song. The Crimson Idol does that. Streets does that. Abigail does that. Them does that. Then you get, these, other tier of concept albums where maybe it tells the story fine, but the songs just can't stand up on their own. For me, that's what happens with Thane to the Throne. Now, there are a lot of people that rank this album very highly. People will say, it's their favorite in the Jag Panzer catalog. And if so, that's awesome. I'm really glad you enjoyed it that much. This is one of those albums I wish I liked it more because it's a very cool idea for them to tackle Shakespeare and take on. I may have said Hamlet earlier, so I did. Apologies. It's obviously Macbeth. I will get those two names back and mixed up from time to time. But yeah, hearing them, tackle Macbeth is really very cool. In theory, it just never, the songs just won't stick with me. And I kind of wish they would. But, whether the song stuck or not, they wasted no time because in 2001, you get your fourth album in 5 years, and that one is called Mechanized Warfare. This one's got Travis Smith cover art of some kind of big, unusual looking, mecha type warrior on it. Um, this one is there's no concept. They just go back to individual songs, and a lot of the songs are quite good. It's got a good opener and Take to the Sky. Again, another these kind of very majestic, big, uplifting, epic type numbers to get the album going. You have more direct numbers on it too, like the follow-up, Frozen of Fear, more straightforward. What else have we got on here? Let's see. Um, yeah, and here's kind of the problem you start to run into on this. A lot of the individual songs are good, but there's not as many necessarily that stand out. And so you end up with, a good album. It's not an S tier amazing album. It's, A or B tier, depending on how much you connect with how many songs off of it. Good stuff, great performances. Um, but and this may be the last one with Chris Broderick too. Maybe he's on one more after this. I'll have to double check. But yeah, this point moving forward, Panzer starts, they kind of find their lane and they stick with it. And we're going to talk about a series of albums that are all good to very good. But yeah, again, it's that age-old problem of none of them ever quite live up to the debut. There's never another one that you feel like really challenges Ample Destruction. Part of the problem with that is, again, Ample Destruction was the only album people had by the band for so long that it really became, the benchmark for the band by default. And so when all these others came out later, it was always the thing people would refer back to. But yeah, Mechanized Warfare, I like the album overall. Good set of songs. It's just not an S tier all-time classic kind of album. It's a good heavy metal album by a band that's great at what they do. All right, after 2001's Mechanized Warfare, there's finally a little bit of a break in the catalog up to 2004. And yeah, just want to check here real quick to see if the next one is going to include Broderick or if he left after Mechanized Warfare. I don't remember offhand. So let's go over here to the Oracle and see. Okay, Broderick is on one more album, as I thought. Now, in the interim here, this is where they finally got that Chain of Command album put out. Century Media kind of, released it. Supposed to be in 87. Came out in 2000. I think it also came out in 2004. Yeah. So Chain of Command finally got its release in 2004. Um, the album features some of the songs that were on that Shadow Thief demo I showed earlier. The thing here is that when Chain of Command was recorded, again, Harry and Joe Tufolo were not in the band, so the vocals here were handled by Bob Parduba, and he's an okay vocalist, but he's trying to fill the shoes of one of the all-time great vocalists, which is always a tall order to do. And as such, the Chain of Command reissue, it's an interesting historical artifact. It's cool that the album finally saw the light of day. But for my money, I'd much rather hear the Shadow Thief demo with Conklin singing on some of those tracks. And again, the Shadow Thief demo got a reissue itself on a high roller at some point. So you can hear that. And for me, there's just no reason to want to play the Chain of Command version over the Shadow Thief version. The track lists are not identical, don't get me wrong. But, it's similar material from a similar era in the band's past. And the Shadow Thief, it's the better lineup with the better set of songs for me. But that wasn't, again, the only thing in 2004. You also had Casting the Stones come out. Not one of the better pieces of cover art. There's a hand and a stone. Casting the Stones. Sure, okay. We get it. Last album with Chris Broderick on guitar, but another really good set of songs here. Feast or Famine's a good opener. The Mission is really good. This one is based on the Guns of Navarone. Panzer's one of those bands that, slip in more than a few songs here and there that are, kind of, warfare, some of them with, a historical bent to them. Very similar to what the band Cage out of California has done over the years. You've got Vigilant, which is one of those songs again where it's got a little bit more of the regal kind of sound to it. You've got Achilles, which is a very good, a little bit aggressive but very epic number. It's strangely short, however. It feels like it's really building to something tremendous, but it wraps up really, really kind of quickly. There's at least one other really good one on here. It might be the closer. Oh yeah, The Harkening is another one of these that, has that kind of a bigger epic sound. It feels like something from the soundtrack of Highlander when they're looking out across, the Scottish and, Irish, landscapes and taking it all in. Yeah, and again, Conklin's voice is great for that. They're good at incorporating those different classical types of instrumentation. Use a little violin or a little cello, a little piano, and it comes together gorgeously on those types of tracks. So, yeah, Casting the Stones is another album where it's like, hey, you've got a good set of songs here, a few noteworthy ones. It's just not an S tier album at the end of the day. Um, the issue here again is you're starting to get, in that, mold. The band, you've got, this as, a good to very good album. But so was this. And, Fame to the Throne for a lot of people. Even back, to the first two comeback albums with Conklin. And so it just feels like, okay, you've got your sound. You're great at what you do. But the albums start to feel a little interchangeable. It's almost like you know what is going to be on the album and how it's going to play out before you even buy the album. Which, for me, at that point, I start wondering, like, how many of these albums do I need to buy? There are some fans, of course, who will buy every single thing a band puts out. And again, these are good albums. It's not like they're declining in quality. It's just that they're getting a bit repetitive. And for some folks, you only want so much repetition before you kind of wish the band would mix things up a little bit. Not go off the deep end. We're not looking for Jag Panzer to become Insane Clown Posse or something. But maybe, flex those songwriting chops some. You've got a killer lineup. You guys are good songwriters. You start to want to hear them try something a little different with their sound. Now, some people I've noticed in reviews have commented they feel like Casting the Stones goes in a little bit more of a European power metal direction. Personally, I don't get that vibe on here. Maybe those folks have just played this a lot more than me and kind of, dug deeper into it and noticed some things I never have. To me, this fits fairly comfortably in this, series of early to mid 2000s era Jagdpanzer. But I thought it worth noting that, yeah, some reviews have mentioned that they feel like the band was straying towards a more melodic direction with European power metal at the time. They didn't continue in that direction if they started it at all. In fact, they didn't do anything for a little bit. There's a bigger break here, the first long gap in the discography. So, Casting the Stones from 2004. And you have to wait about 7 years for the follow-up, which is, The Scourge of the Light. The CD here. This one, it kind of, follows suit. It's like, it's another good or very good Jag Panzer album. Kind of just depends on like maybe how many tracks really click with you as above average. And this one does have some really good ones. This one has a very annoying font for the track list. So, yeah, these are a pain to read. I know one of the standouts I like a lot on it is the second track, The Setting of the Sun. It's another one of those where they've got, some of the strings can come in. Conklin's voice can soar. It's a very big, vast sounding song. Beautiful stuff. They nail it on those kind of songs. The closer, Book of Kills, is another one of those. It's, a little longer, a little more epic in structure. Works great. So it's another one of these albums that just feels like that's a good album. It's a very good album. Is it A tier? Is it B tier? It's for me, I'd probably put this one A tier. I tend to like this one. It's just not an S tier album. And, you can call it first world problems. You can call it, whatever. You just always feel like there's a masterpiece lurking in this band that should, be right up there with Ample Destruction. And it feels like they've never quite released that album. They released a really good album, but it's never quite on that S tier. But yeah, Scourge of the Light, very good one as well. Another big break in the catalog at this point. You go to let's see, that one was 2011. The next one is 2017, so 6 years off. And you get this one, which I don't have a hard copy of. It's entitled The Deviant Chord. Kind of a cool cover art. Not sure what the deal is. It immediately makes me think Jekyll and Hyde, except the dude is some kind of lizard snake thing. So that's going on. Regardless, one of the noteworthy things with this album is Joe Tafola makes another return. So he's back in the band for this one album, and it's a really good album. It's one I should pick up sometime. I don't know it as well as the others since I don't have it, but I've heard it a few times here and there. And yeah, it's got a really bright production, sounds great, and a really good set of tracks. Looking here, a few to point out. The standout one is again the track that kind of emulates the Moors. This time it's called Foggy Dew, which doesn't sound like a particularly, good title for a heavy metal track. It's track number 5 there. But yeah, this is a gorgeous piece of music. It's, like I said, they revisit that particular style of song from time to time, and it works really, really well. But yeah, I like the Deviant Chord. I think it's one of the better ones in this part of the discography. Yeah, definitely a good one to check out. This one is also on Steamhammer. So at this point, in this last gap, they had left Century Media. Let's see. Well, actually, I'm wondering this. Looking at Scourge of the Light. Actually, that one is on SPV Steamhammer 2. So yeah, the last one for Century Media, we got to back up a little bit to Casting the Stones. Forgot to mention that they had switched labels during that interim. But yeah, Deviant Chord, another very good album in the Jag Panzer catalog. But then you've got another 6 year break before you get their most recent album, which I think puts us at album number 10, which is called The Hallowed. Now, this one, when it came out a couple of years ago, I reviewed it over on the Heavy Metallurgy channel. Some noteworthy things on this: cool cover artwork, kind of dig it there. It's another concept album. This one's based on a graphic novel, which I do not remember the title of, but the gist of the story is that, humanity's in some kind of, post-apocalyptic Mad Max kind of scenario, except this time it's like a very wintry scenario. The world's, I don't know if it's slipped into an ice age or there's a nuclear winter or whatever, but, everything is cold and frozen, and that's one of the problems that, humanity's having to deal with is surviving in this harsh, wintry terrain. And to survive, humans and animals start to develop a much deeper bond once again. I think there's like an underlying message of like, humans reconnecting with nature a bit, with nature being represented by the animals that are, and it's not like they're talking to the animals. They're not becoming like, familiars or something. But that, yeah, the two groups are learning to, work together, coexist, survive, and, get through this hard time. And it all has a very happy ending. At the end, you find out that the whole album's been, somebody telling the story of the hard times, to like, the next generation of kids so that they remember where they came from and how they got through it all. Works really good as a story, and this time a lot of the individual songs work individually quite well as a bonus. So you don't have the problem that you had with Thane to the Throne where the songs just kind of run together and don't stand out. This has really good individual songs too. Overall, the album feels like it's probably a little bit heavier than other albums during the 21st century. It's a little less ornate feeling because, again, I think they're focusing on the story more. And when they do have some, like different, spoken parts or quiet parts, some of that is used to kind of, help narrate a little bit and, tell parts of the story here and there so that you don't get as many of those things worked into the songs directly. But yeah, it's another one of those like very good albums that feels, like all these other albums we've been talking about, these two and the Deviant Chord and this one and this one. And you know, that's what you get with Jag Panzer. They're absolutely, kind of, top of the class among US traditional heavy metal bands. Their catalog. For me, overall, I think it's a much stronger and more consistent catalog than a lot of their contemporaries who have stuck around and earned the same kind of veteran status. It's just that, you know, if you're not a diehard fan of the band, do you need every single Jag Panzer album? It's hard to make that case because while they are all good, many of them are also working very much in the same vein. If you like the band a lot, you say, yes, they are really consistent, and that's great. If you're sort of medium on this style of, metal, you say like, they're stuck in a rut. They make the same album over and over. Yeah. Both phrases kind of mean the same thing, but the connotation's very different. One sounds kind of a positive, one's kind of a negative. And so, yeah, it kind of comes down to a matter of, personal taste. I've always enjoyed the band's work. They're very talented, great group of musicians. I love Conklin's voice. I love all of Mark Brody's, guitar work. They've always had great guitarists. I didn't name all of them, but even like after Chris Broderick leaves, they replace one hotshot guitarist with another. Joey Tafola comes back in. He leaves. They get another hotshot guitarist. Yeah, they've always had, massive sound. The rhythm section's always, amazing as well, not to leave them out. It's just that, yeah, they have at this point been back on the scene for uh, coming up on 30 years. They put out a lot of good albums. I just would love to see them maybe on the next album try to break out of that mold a little bit. Do something that's going to surprise fans that still works within the Jag Panzer formula, but expand that formula. Make it so that when we hear that next album, we're like, holy shit, I did not see that coming, and that's fucking awesome. You guys nailed it with something new and different. That would be amazing to hear. Whether it happens or not, we'll have to wait and see. And if the schedule from recent years is any indication, we may have to wait until close to the end of the decade before another Panzer album comes out. But who knows? Maybe they'll be inspired and churn out something before we know it. We'll just have to wait and see. All right, that's going to do it for this topic. So now let's talk metal in the comments down below. If you are a Panzer fan, what are some of your favorite albums or favorite songs? And where do you stand on this issue of bands that put out long strings of really good albums, but they're also just kind of very consistent albums that they never really stray from their formula much? Do you like that pattern from a band? Do you buy up all of those albums and enjoy them equally? Or do you start to feel a bit burnt out after a certain point? And it's just like, I got the last four Accept records. They're all okay, but do I really need the next one coming out? Because it's going to be exactly like the other four. What are your thoughts on that issue? There's no right or wrong answer to it. Different people are going to have a different reaction to it, and that's absolutely fine. Let's shut this down for the evening. Hope folks have enjoyed hearing about the Jag Panzer discography. If you've never gotten around to checking them out, I would highly recommend it. They are sort of the class of US traditional heavy metal, and it's really cool that they, were able to come back and have a successful push in the 21st century after almost slipping into obscurity with only one good album from the 80s and that one failed experiment from the mid 90s. That's it for now. So until next time, everybody take care. And as always, keep banging your head.